Georgia camp feeling like Fields turned and ran on the program. Fact of the matter is, I don't even know what the Big Ten title game looks like right now, but if Ohio State cakewalks in the college football playoff and cakewalks and continues to do things offensively, which they've been doing all season long, they've been the top 3 in points scored all season long. Jeff, that is a horrible look for Georgia, and that's something else that you'll lay at the feet of Kirby Smart for how that was handled, because it seems difficult to explain how all that went down.
Wisconsin is up 7-0 at the end of the first quarter in that Big Ten title game.
Well, there you go. Point notwithstanding, it's just going to be a tough situation for Georgia to deal with. And listen, I have put people off in the comment section about this for weeks and weeks and weeks and months and months and months, saying, enjoy the season, enjoy the ride, let's see where it goes, let's see where it goes. Those were some of the people saying, see, I told you so. This offense would have been better with Justin Fields. Jeff, those people deserve to have their say.
So, here's the...
Hold on, respond to that first.
Well, repeat your question, please.
That the people who say this offense would have been better with Justin Fields deserve to have their say, given the fact that Fields looks to be likely in the college football playoff, even though they're losing right now, and Georgia's not going to be.
Well, I mean, you got a systemic thing there where you got to sit there and say, who were the ones that made that decision? Who were the ones that that led that situation to fester and led Justin to feel like he was not being used properly or didn't think he had a future here in this program? I think that's what you got to look at, and as how. Everybody's in a take business, but I think this year, with the lack of the receiver core, the lack of the production experience, efficiency in the receiver core, Justin Fields was a better fit for this offense at Georgia because he could make things happen in the RPO with his legs. He could spring a DeAndre Swift. He could help in those areas where Georgia is vertically challenged to move the ball down the field. Fromm last year, I think, was able to hold him off by doing what he does best in practice and in games because he had those receivers that can make plays for him. I think everybody can get into that. That guy's playing in the Big Ten championship game, and Georgia just got dribbled by 27 points in the SEC championship game. It's like I'll go back to this was the worst kind of loss because I feel like I was in the dentist chair, Brandon, and LSU just put Georgia to sleep. And there's no gnashing of the teeth. There's no, man, it stinks to come on and broadcast after another disappointing big game performance for Georgia. I think the main thing, we came into this game, and if anybody said, Brandon, Connor, Georgia's going to run the ball 25 times for 61 yards against LSU. There's no way anything else was going to be built off Georgia's victory chances or probability.
Yeah, for a large portion of this game, I don't know what the final stats look like. Joe Burrow was outrushing the entire Georgia team, and that's a disaster.
Yeah, I think Hilaire has 57 yards rushing and like a lot of garbage time. He has 57 yards receiving. And, man, when Georgia was just trying to spark something up and the catches were there or the throws were open and they weren't made, you just needed something, and Georgia just could not move the ball. Folks, that's 2.6 yards per carry, and they came into this game thinking whether it's Zamir White, Brian Harrion, James Cook, how much you can get out of DeAndre Swift, they had to run the ball. And then it just kind of downward spiraled. You see Blaylock go out. You see Fromm down with an ankle. There's nothing they could do. Even when you saw how creative they tried to get with DeAndre Swift. They tried to make him a de facto slot receiver, get him out on the edge where he can make plays and stay away from the perimeter, stay away from the interior of the box. I mean, there was a point where I was just like, man, DeAndre Swift just needs to be the slot receiver the rest of this game with Dominic Blaylock out because he can make some plays out there, and then he won't risk that shoulder.
And listen, obviously DeAndre Swift's injury is a big storyline. There was a reason it got covered so much leading up to the game. But, Connor, you've written a million words about this team. I've obviously spoken a million words about this team. If we want to go back before the season started, a DeAndre Swift injury was not supposed to completely lock down any chance you have of winning a game. As with all due respect to DeAndre Swift, he's a great player. But given how deep we at one time thought Georgia was, a Swift injury is not supposed to injure any chance you have of winning.
No, and he didn't play a whole lot in the second half. And I got to step away for a second. I just had something come out.
That's all right. I'll give you the same thing that I just said to Connor Riley. DeAndre is a great player, but that's not what we thought about this team in July, August. All the words we spoke about, the great Georgia offensive line and the depth of the running game. I mean, one of the most disappointing aspects of this season is that identity that we thought Georgia had. It was so easily neutralized by opponents. LSU, another example of that. LSU had not been great against the run all season long, but Georgia being so predictable because of how inept it is throwing the ball, all of a sudden, really very little from Zamir White, very little from James Cook, very little from, Brian Herring's a warrior, but it's, doesn't add up to a whole lot statistically. go back to the summertime, I never would have imagined that DeAndre Swift being taken off a field meant Georgia had no offense whatsoever.
So you look at last year's team, and this is what I think about in terms of the offensive line and all those stalwarts, except for Lamont Galliard, that are back for the 2019 season. Brendan, you remember Elijah Holyfield ran for 1,000 yards along with DeAndre Swift last year. And you just never saw that offensive line marshal it up when it counted. And this was a hang your hat on the offensive line football game. And you see the way Georgia had just sputters today. And it was almost like I just keep my back to. This was probably the worst way Georgia could lose in terms of it opens everything up for criticism in terms of what's not working, what needs to be done, and what needs to be fixed. Because somehow all these players Georgia has offensively, they're just not being featured in a way to use their talents to the best of their ability. And you got to look, is that schematically? Is that just the dearth that they have at wide receiver, which means it puts more pressure on a run game, more pressure on an offensive line that wasn't performing like a Joe Moore award-winning type of offensive line this year. I mean, I think that one of the fatal stats of this 2019 regular season, and especially the games that mattered in 2019, is 2.6 yards per carry against LSU, when that sort of seemed like what Georgia's defense should have done to LSU tonight.
Yeah, I'm mostly I mean, you and I have been different in the offensive line this year. Even though the stats aren't quite to end the season what they were at one point in time and not what they were last year, I mostly attribute that to just how confident opposing defenses could be of what Georgia was going to do and very little threat of the ball being thrown over their head. They kind of outnumbering the box. Keith Simmons brings up a point, and this is one of those nights where everything kind of is fair game. Makes the comparison between Kirby Smart and Mark Richt. And when those comparisons have come up at the end of last season, I've kind of, for the most part, pushed back against those, even though the records for the two coaches were almost identical. I pushed back because Georgia had been in back-to-back major bowls. You know, Georgia was blowing out most of its regular season opponents. All of a sudden, the Richt-Kirby comparison, at least for right now, in the moment we're in at the moment, it does feel a little more reasonable, and it does feel like worth considering a little bit more, because what you saw from Mark Richt when he first took the Georgia job, meager first season, win the SEC in 2002, and then after that, kind of not really taking that next step, and you're either growing in life or you're reducing, and you know, once Georgia started plateauing, there was also some regression. Has Georgia hit a peak here in 4 years of Kirby Smart that it's going to have a difficult time matching in 2020? Hard not to think there's at least a significant chance that the Georgia team that we see on the field in 2020, because of how bad this one was in so many key areas for the full measure of the season, it's at least worth asking is Georgia less of a national championship contender in 2020 than it was in 2019, because of the fact that if Georgia tries to come back out and do this the same way, go about its business the same way, then it's likely to just have the same results, if not worse, this time around.
Yeah, this is a loss that everybody, I think in your last comment there, you brought up the word plateau or peaked a couple of times, and folks are going to start to wonder, like, how does this team look better? How does this team look different? And it's one of those that opens up a lot of criticism, especially on the elite stage, because you would think Georgia has the players to go toe-to-toe with an LSU right now. And, you know, it really looked to me like there was a matter of execution in a lot of areas of the game today. And that's not just the plays, it's the players doing what they're supposed to. It's the guys, like on offense, everybody says all the time, you got to have all 11 players doing the same thing or on the same page. Otherwise, it's not going to work. I mean, I've got friends of mine, they're texting me in the middle of the game, and they're talking about, they're noticing how the receivers and the routes they're running. They're even mentioning, they hear it on the play-by-play broadcast, how, even Georgia great Eric Zier is noticing that he needs more out of the routes the wide receivers are running. It's just one of those things where Georgia just comes out of this wondering, do they have enough firepower to deal with an LSU right now? And the answer is pretty telling on the scoreboard.
Yeah, I talked to a former Georgia player tonight, too, kind of in the late stage of the game. He kind of brought up a similar point about some receiver routes that he felt like there were some guys looking for green grass in moments when the coverage was actually man coverage. Something where you're supposed to be running away from a body. You had guys running to green grass, almost as if, and he would know better than me, obviously, but almost as if there was some confusion about whether the defense was showing man or zone at that time, that he said it looked like some of the Georgia receivers were running zone-style routes against what was kind of a softer version of man coverage. So, I mean, there's obviously a lot of blame to go around. I'm not going to sit here and do the blame game stuff all night long, But I do think it's fair to say that nobody can be excused from it. I think everybody bears responsibility in this. And I think some of those tough questions that you put off asking during a season because they're unpleasant and they kind of get people stirred up and things like that, I think tonight's a night to ask it all. Is Kirby Smart veering into a Mark Richt territory? Was Georgia wrong not to play Justin Fields more last year and now let Fields go off to Ohio State where, he has a chance of being a Heisman finalist or something like that? Those are not easy questions to answer, but they're not unfair to ask on a night like this, a moment that crystallizes what everybody knew, at least in large measure, a lot of people knew throughout the season, that Georgia offensively could not keep up with the nation's best teams.
Yeah, and it kept putting pressure on their defense. And, Brendan, it harkens to my mind that you saw how Georgia was fighting and trying to make this a game 17-3 at the half. And, man, if they could have just marshaled up one more touchdown, or maybe they hit that big ball to start a game. Blaylock, that's such an unfortunate injury to that young man, Brandon. But it looks like Georgia defensively is where it needs to be to go with an elite team, because that's going to be very hard to hold an LSU team like that under 30 points. That's what everybody said had to happen. I think it harkens back to something you said a long time ago, where there was a point in Nick Saban's time where he had to sit there and go, is this going to get me where I need to go the next 5 or 6 years of my program? Because you're here. How do you go to there? And how do you distance yourself from the rest of the teams in the country? And I think these are going to have to open up some really tough questions and some really hard evaluation of Georgia next year. Sure. And, me being the recruiting guy, Georgia will not be in a talent deficit next year with receivers, provided all those players come in. They'll have more speed. They might have some great big bodies to throw to at the tight end spot. Georgia's just got to get more explosive than just putting their hand on the ground and mashing and mauling teams, physical run-first football, because that's not going to work against a team as elite as LSU. And next year it won't be LSU. It'll be some other team that's got the magic formula, and they got everything figured out with a hot quarterback and a great cadre of wide receivers. And maybe the guys up front are just good enough to get done what they want to get done. Georgia's going to have to figure out a way to where they are as skilled and as blessed offensively in terms of making the plays, being explosive, as they are defensively with all those players. And there was a lot of times in this game where that defenders were fighting. They were forcing field goals. The Kobe Dean makes a stop. I mean, we didn't even talk about, the defensive effort today. It looked a lot like Auburn's game plan. At times it looked like a 1-3, 1-4, 1-2-6. It looked like Georgia was walking everybody down. Lewis Seen plays most of the whole game in a role where that was the guy that gets on the field. And you saw at different points of the game, it looked a lot like Auburn's blueprint for how they tried to hang
7 defensive backs in the game a good bit.
And then what they did is except in red zone situations, Monty Rice and Tay Crowder were out of the game, and Jermaine Johnson and Adam Anderson were in there just trying to deal with Joe Burrow and the athleticism he brings to the table. Even when Georgia was getting third downs and making the LSU work for things, then there goes Burrow pulling a play out of a hat. I thought that batted ball, which he catches it and then runs it for 20 yards.
A lot of guys in the locker room were talking about that.
Was a huge indicator. You talk about bad first quarters. That was another bad first quarter for Georgia, where it just seemed like they couldn't get anything right, even on the health front, the injury front, and then those plays.
Yeah, I think exactly right. I've got a lot I want to say about what you just said. It's our Pella Windows Postgame Show. That's Jeff Sintel. I'm Brandon Adams. We're live down here on the field at Mercedes-Benz Stadium. Georgia loses badly tonight in LSU to LSU in the SEC Championship. Still, though, thankful to be having Pella Window and Door bring it all to us. Of course, they can help equip your house with energy-efficient windows and doors. They've also got a great offer for you right now. You can get 0% APR for 48 months. That's valid through January 9th, or 40% off qualifying installations over the course of that time as well. So between now and January 9th, take advantage of that. You can save money on your heating bill and your energy costs with energy-efficient windows and doors from Pella Window and Door of Georgia. As I said before, 40% off qualifying installations or 0% APR for 48 months. A couple ways to get in touch. PellaSoutheast.us. That's PellaSoutheast.us. That's the website or the number to dial. The Dunwoody Showroom, you can get in touch with them at 404-445-2979. 404-445-2979. Pella Window and Door of Georgia is viewed to be the best. A lot of comments coming up on both Facebook and YouTube. Jeff, I want to talk about the defensive configuration that Georgia was using. And a lot of folks remember early in the first quarter, there's the man rush for Georgia that gives Burrow forever to throw and finally finds Terrace Marshall for a touchdown. And that's an example of Georgia having those 7 defensive backs in the game. And, you had Stevenson and Seen kind of standing where a linebacker would typically stand, but kind of operating as kind of a dime back and whatever you call a 7th defensive back. I'm not even sure what the name of that, something like that would be. I know Auburn used that configuration a little bit against LSU as well. But what it did, though, Jeff, and I was, sitting up there in the press box kind of looking down on it, I couldn't help but remark that LSU has convinced Georgia to stop trying to be a physical team. Because when you've got 7 defensive backs in the game, you're almost playing like a flag football style where everybody's a speed player. They've got a bunch of receivers. You've got a bunch of defensive backs. So here's this thing of all week long when you and I would talk about the game, I'm like, hey, can the Georgia physicality, can it up in LSU? Can Georgia be the tougher team? Can Georgia be the more physical team? Well, the fact of the matter is LSU convinced Georgia by the way it used its personnel to not even try to be physical, to not have any outside linebackers in the game. Jeff, Georgia may have recruited outside linebackers better than just about any program ever has, as certainly in the last few years, as well as anyone has. And then in the early stage of this game, up until LSU had built a convincing lead, Georgia's not playing any of those guys at all. I mean, I actually talked to Nolan Smith about this. I said, was it frustrating knowing that not only were you not in the game, no outside linebacker was in the game a lot tonight because you had so many defensive backs that had to be out there? And obviously Nolan gave a great answer to that, and he's obviously a sharp guy, and he's he felt good about the defensive game plan going in, but that's kind of the story there, that LSU through its personnel convinced Georgia to just not be a physical team.
It's funny, what the number one thing that flashed in my mind as you were saying this is somehow this Georgia defense and the way it's been built and the way it's looked so good throughout the season with all those pretty stats everyone trotted out, LSU dictated to Georgia what it had to be in by its personnel packages and its threat factor outside. When Georgia had to go to 7 defensive backs, first of all, well, those 7 defensive backs were pretty good guys when you have Tyreek Stevenson in the game early and Lewis Seen in the game early as well. That means 2 freshmen, though. And it really – and the way they have to play, the way they're built is they want to force their will. They want to be aggressive. They want to be physical because that's the way Georgia was going to have to win this game defensively. And there were so many points in this game where I'm like, sooner or later you're going to pick your poison because Burrow is going to make somebody miss. Burrow's going to run around. He's going to hit somebody. I thought the play he made right down there was absolutely brilliant. And everybody on Twitter was like, well, it was a bunch of missed tackles. And first of all, Georgia's got a great tackling football team. You've seen it all year.
Burrow's the real deal.
Burrow, how not only he escaped it, he had his eyes downfield and hit his man on the run for a huge 80-yard play that it was one of those many moments tonight where I looked like and said, that's Joe Burrow wrapping up the Heisman Trophy over and over again.
So I promise you're going to get a lot of comments. Let me ask you one more question before we get there, though. So go back to the BCS era and think about these kinds of matchups. Auburn plays Oregon. Auburn convinces Oregon to play the physical game because it was able to dictate the pace. Think about Florida facing the Sam Bradford Oklahoma team. Think about Texas versus Alabama back when Colt McCoy was the Longhorns quarterback. Think about these moments in which it's like spread style team against powerful SEC team, and the powerful SEC team in that era just seemed to be able to convince the other style that they were the SEC guy was going to dictate the pace. This game was going to be about physicality. It was going to be about defense. It was going to be about running the football. And the SEC goes on a long streak of winning national championships in that kind of BCS era. And all of those games kind of had a similar storyline. Prolific offense for the opponent, powerful SEC team, but the SEC team dictated the pace. For whatever reason, in this playoff era we're in now, and I'm not saying the change in format's what's caused this, but it's worth pointing out, then this kind of modern age we live in, when you have team like Georgia playing team like LSU, more often than not, it's the other guy who seems to dictate the pace. I mean, Georgia won the 2017 Rose Bowl, but that game was played at a pace comfortable for Oklahoma tonight with LSU and Georgia. Obviously, LSU was able to dictate the pace really throughout. They did whatever they wanted. They controlled kind of everything. So, in this debate of is Kirby Smart going to have to make some changes, I think one of the strongest arguments in favor of you can't keep doing things the way that you have been doing is because in a game like this, you have to be different anyway. So you might as well get good at it over the course of the season, because in a game like this, you end up chasing them around all day long and playing their game. You're not playing your best defensive players. This is supposed to be a program built around defense, but you're not even able to play your best defensive players because of how, I guess Joe Brady's just the smartest guy that's ever lived. I guess he's just Albert Einstein on a football field. I guess no one's ever been smarter, because Georgia's got its best players sitting on the bench because they're so afraid of the game plan that Brady and Burrow have designed.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it has a lot to do with, man, those LSU plays were being executed well, and they were also being executed with elite performers. I mean, when you start going to their second and third wide receivers and they're making plays on Georgia, and then you got Burrow doing it. And I mean, the things that boggle my mind about this game is LSU doesn't commit a turnover. Georgia doesn't force a turnover. There was that one glimmer where they thought they had one when Lewis Singh jumped on a fumble, but that one was overturned. And you have Georgia, they can't even run the ball on LSU. They can't keep pace. Like, for instance, let's say Georgia had an explosive passing game tonight, Brandon. Let's say they were hitting those deep shots and it was 20-17 or 17-14 at the half. They were just going to be a point, even when they were getting stops against LSU, even when the defense was bowing its necks or whatever. They were just going to be a point where they were going to have to run the football. They were going to have to try to get more out of the wide receiver core, get more out of the tight end spot. And those pieces, Brandon, they're just not out there tonight.
Well, let's get some Facebook comments here. Hugh Waters on the subject of the quarterback, mobile and accurate. One of the things that I'll never understand this season is what has happened to Fromm's accuracy. Now, tonight, a few of the throws he threw tonight were beautiful. I mean, this is one of those games where no one was bad all the game long, and frankly, no one was good for very long either.
Seemed like Burrow was good the whole game.
Yeah, I'm talking about the purple and gold, they were fine. Yeah. I'm saying on this sideline, obviously there's plenty of blame to go around, but even when you isolate this away from trust in wide receivers and things like that, and that's not an insignificant issue, not at all. Jake Fromm is just less accurate this year than he used to be, and that's a really difficult thing for me to understand. I told people a lot during the offseason, they would say, well, what's Fromm's elite skill? I always said accuracy, and I've had people that know the quarterback position really well talk about how important the accuracy is and how they felt like that, Fromm didn't have the strongest arm, he didn't have this, didn't have that, but he always had the accuracy, and you can win with accuracy. But somewhere along the way this year, that accuracy has subsided. You give me an accurate Jake Fromm compared to a Justin Fields, there's a really good chance I'll take an accurate Jake Fromm over Justin Fields. But when Fromm does not have that pinpoint accuracy, at that point in time, it's hard to make those comparisons to him and the great quarterbacks. What happened to Jake's accuracy this year?
Yeah, you hear you see a lot of chatter. You have people reaching out to you, and they're saying there's something wrong with his mechanics. He's throwing the ball not off of base. He's not stepping into his throws. Those are all systemic, but they're throws he makes tonight. Like you said, they're throws that he makes tonight. That's a Jake Fromm thrower. That's the Jake Fromm that needs to get cooking and be sharp to give Georgia a puncher's chance to get back in this. And then you see, there's a ball here, ball there, where he needs to make that throw. He needs to be better on that play. And here's the nature of what I'm feeling right here. We come on these shows and we have to chatter about, okay, didn't like this, didn't like that. That needs to get better. This is for the first time. This is what I'm feeling right now. It is basically, this is not going to get fixed with new players. It's not going to get fixed with super wide receivers and better wide receivers. And instead of one or two players like Dominic Blaylock and George Pickens, you need 3 or 4 guys, or you need Mecole Hardman back, or you need a 5-star tight end in there. Something has to happen with this offensive identity where, hey, if the run game's not there, they can beat a team tonight which doesn't have an elite defense. They can beat it a different way besides physicality and chopping wood. Because right now, tonight, when you look at that run game, 25 carries for 61 yards, there's no game plan ever drawn up. Joe Brady, the genius Joe Brady, could not draw up a game plan for Georgia tonight where they were going to beat LSU with 25 carries for 61 yards.
Yeah, I think that's true. And James Crump in our Facebook comment section says that he thinks that Kirby will keep Coley until Georgia starts losing recruits. And you say, hey, recruits won't fix what's broken with Georgia. And I've certainly said that in the past myself, that there's a schematic issue that seems more important than recruiting. But Jeff, this is as negative as you'll ever hear me be. The caliber of defensive recruit that Georgia gets in living rooms for is far different than the caliber of offensive recruit that Georgia gets in living rooms for. And obviously, everybody loves Kendall Milton and excited about him coming to Georgia. But that's like one guy, right? That's like the exception that proves the rule. I'm always fascinated by going back and look at the early days of the Kirby Smart era. Not just the 2017 class, but Jeff, you reported on this at the time. Do you remember how the 2018 class was coming together before the 2017 season took place? Recruits are always the first to know. And back in 2017, those guys that would become the 2018 signing class, they knew something was happening at Georgia before Georgia went to the college football playoff. You came on Dog Nation Daily one time and said the Georgia coaches laugh at the notion that the whole what's wrong with Georgia recruiting, because you already had this movement for the 2018 class. Recruits knew that Georgia was the place to be. Well, Jeff, I got to tell you, I think there's a similar forecast going on right now for the opposite when it comes to the offense. Recruits on the offensive side of the ball, 5-star receivers, 5-star elite playmaking tight end, 2021 quarterbacks. The top playmakers in college football seem to have sniffed it out that Georgia's not the place to be. Georgia's not in any of their living rooms. Georgia's not in any of their living rooms. So the idea that Kirby's going to have to move on from Coley once recruits figure it out, recruits have figured it out.
Well, let me respond to that. I get the heart of what you're saying there, but we've talked about this even on Hedges over the last week or so. They're changing things dramatically at the receiver spot. I think that Corey Wren going in another direction. The name's Jermaine Burton. The name's Arian Smith. The name Marcus Fleming. Brandon, those are different receivers. Burton's the top 75 prospect. Smith's the top 75 prospect. Burton's the top 44 prospect. They've got to bring in dudes that can make plays immediately, and that's what they're trying to do in the 2020 class. And to add to the Kendall Milton, to add to those great offensive linemen, they just got to get special out there on the outside. Like, Georgia's always going to be able to recruit elite defensive backs because look what Georgia does with its defensive backs. That's Kirby Smart's acumen. Georgia, someone asked me the question about a week ago, and I think it's telling, where they said, Jeff, is Georgia better at tight end? And this is nothing against Charlie Warner. He's going to go down as one of the greatest Bulldog parts of this early part of Kirby Smart's era. He does what's asked, blocks his hip pads off every week, and you have Eli Wolf, who comes in from Tennessee, and he's in the game for a lot of times. Georgia was in 22 personnel a lot tonight in a lot of these stretches. But I go back to Luke Ford, Brandon. If Luke Ford was still in this offense, and he's a little bit more special at wide receiver, a big target, can run around, sure-handed, can block, I just don't know if Georgia's offense is demonstrably different if you have a true elite tight end out there, an elite tight end, big body recruit out there to help them to give Jake Fromm another target.
But would you acknowledge, and maybe you don't agree, and that's fine if you don't, Georgia's recruiting brand defensively is magnitudes different than it is offensive. Would you acknowledge that?
Well, yeah, they've got to change it, and that's what I think they're trying to change the room at tight end this year. That's Todd Hartley's mantra, the new tight ends coach. That's what Cortez Hankton is trying to do now late in this season, where Georgia's going in a different direction. Folks, Marcus Rosemy really good. He's going to come play for Georgia. He's going to give you George Pickens type, Dominic Blaylock type stuff his first year at Georgia. That's great. Now they need to bring in somebody that brings in something more. If they can sign Arian Smith to be that burner down the field, to maybe not be exactly like an Alabama receiver, but more like a Jalen Waddle, more like that guy that can turn something into nothing into something. Georgia just has to do something. They've put together such a massive collection of running backs, offensive line, road graders, that they got to do something when teams try to take all that away. And I think, Brandon, that's what they're trying to do. And I feel what you're saying. If they weren't in the room now or in the conversation now with a Burton, with an Arian Smith, with a Rosemy, they're trying to change things to where Georgia looks a little bit less, or just looks a lot more scary at the wide receiver position.
All right, hold on. I'm Zach Dempsey. I want to read your comment, but I want to get some clarification on Jeff. When you say they're trying to change things, do you mean they're trying to change their offensive philosophy, or they're trying to change the overall talent level at the receiver position?
Well, I think it starts with that because
Wait, what's that? What do you mean?
I think it starts with upgrading the talent all across the board, 1 through 5. Like, for instance, how can you weather George Pickens out of the game for a half? How can you weather a serious, unfortunate injury to Dominic Blaylock? That's because you have 2 or 3 more guys like that. I mean, for instance, Brady's great, Burrow's great, but let's not back off the fact that Jamar Chase, Terrace Marshall, and Justin Jefferson are as good as any receivers Georgia has. I don't even know if George Pickens would be the number 4 receiver on that team right now.
And it's fair to point out, Kirby said something similar this week about Alabama. Oh, they changed their offense because they magically got Jerry Jeudy, Devontae Smith. Those wide receivers weren't delivered by elves. Alabama made it a point to go out there and do that. And, if Georgia really wants to do that, and maybe the Burtons and the Smiths of the world, maybe they are the change agents. But it's not the same thing as Julian Fleming, you know what I'm saying? Or I'm sorry, it's not the same thing as, there's a different caliber receiver that may have given Georgia an official visit, but was peace up and out when the official visit was over with.
Well, but I think, especially for me, and this is my business, I think it's amazing that Georgia can sign a George Pickens, number 5 wide receiver, Dominic Blaylock, number 6 wide receiver. Hadn't done that in 10 years before those guys did last year with a top 10 receiver. And then they're in the mix now for 2 more in the 2020 class. And I think it starts with that, where somehow Georgia's getting guys to come in and believe that. And I think this game, Brandon, in some ways, it's not as painful as the Alabamas. It's not as painful as those losses the last few years. But I think this is a game, and if, we here at Dog Nation want to try and look at things both ways here, it's a game that makes people look in the mirror and make hard choices about what we're doing right now. We got to open it all up. We got to open it all up to do things a little bit differently than we're doing it right now.
But it's not clear that Kirby Smart's going to do that. Not clear at all. And I asked a few Georgia players tonight, does Georgia need to be more like LSU going forward? Nobody would say that on the record, whether they believe that or not. I'm going to take them at their word that they were saying their truth. They think that Georgia needs to be more like Georgia. I asked Isaiah Wilson, are you envious of the fact that LSU makes the offense look so easy? And he says, no, I'm not envious of anything. They're just a great team. So I'll ask you the question that Georgia players either don't agree with or didn't want to answer. Do you think moving forward Georgia needs to be more like LSU? Being more like LSU means being less like it is now. LSU doesn't play 12 personnel ever. They don't have 2 tight end sets. They have like 1 tight end on the whole team that basically plays. The defense is going to be back on the field in some cases a little bit more frequently. You're going to take some risks, playing higher scoring games. Kirby Smart's going to have less control over the overall program than he has right now. Do you think that Georgia in the future needs to be more like LSU?
Yeah. So here's what I think about that. That's going to have to deal with a big philosophy change by what the staff wants to see out there. And I mean by that is the offensive system has got to realize that everybody comes with this protect the defense type stuff and keep them off the field and long sustained drives that wear teams down.
But if you were in charge of Georgia football, I'm going to give you the power. And obviously our opinions don't have that kind of power, but we get to weigh in, and you all do as well. We'll take more of your comments. If I gave you the power, are you going to look at Big Sam Pittman and his big offensive lineman and say, in the future, this program is going to be a little bit less about you and a little bit more about what's happening on the edges, what's happening in the quarterback position, what's happening in the dynamic offensive realm? We may play some higher scoring games because we got our brains beat in tonight by a team that's played high scoring games all season long. If I gave you the power, are you waving a magic wand and starting a transformation that results in Georgia being a little bit more like LSU?
So, honestly, I'm gonna consider your point, but the first thing that comes to mind.
It's really just a question.
Well, I know what you're trying to ask, but I'm going to consider the following: is I sit there and I go, is it the system or is it the execution? Is it the players and the execution? Because we weren't asking these questions about the offense last year, Brandon.
Sometimes we were. A decent amount we were. I think you forget. A decent amount we were.
But last year they had the ability to throw it around. Remember, this was the team that threw the ball for 300 yards on Alabama.
Right, but they didn't have a single receiver.
They had making plays. They had 2,000-yard receivers. I think it all starts with Georgia and maybe we should have saw this coming when you remember that fall scrimmage where Pickens makes the viral catch. But some of the things that came out of that was that the offensive line couldn't move the ball on the defensive line, that they were getting stopped, and they were like one score in 6 drives. I think that was the numbers or whatever. So you have that combined with you don't have the same firepower at wide receiver. It becomes an identity crisis a little bit for Georgia about what can they be great at when they can't even be great about running the football.
Paul Miller says you're going to talk about Kirby Smart. He's not going to change. He hasn't after 2 terrible losses to Bama. Still hasn't changed. I mean,
different kind of loss, though. Don't you feel that way? This is a we got to look at everything type loss rather than those where one play here, keep the edge on Jalen Hurts. If DeAndre Walker doesn't go out,
well, it's fair to say Georgia didn't score in the second half of either of those games.
Correct. But there's a point when you look at this Georgia offense. I mean, it's the offense, right?
Is there anybody in Athens powerful enough to say to Kirby Smart, you must change? I'm not sure there is. I'm not sure there's anyone who works the university, who donates to the university. I'm not sure there's anyone right now powerful enough to say, hey, 4 years in, it's not working. Now, obviously, Kirby Smart's leading Georgia in a way that no one ever has, and you won't hear me backtrack off that at all. Kirby Smart's direction of the program in terms of the ability to bring in talent is incredible. Georgia's on its way to 3 consecutive major bowl appearances. That's not nothing. 3 straight wins of the East. That's not nothing. So I'm not down on Kirby Smart necessarily, but I am curious if he's even willing to alter anything about his philosophy, and if there's someone in Athens powerful enough, either because of money or job title, to say, Kirby, I hate to tell you, buddy, you got it kicked in against LSU. You're going to have to do a better job than this. You're going to have to find somebody who can do a better job than this in some form or fashion. Is there somebody powerful enough to tell Kirby Smart that?
I think he's got to look in the mirror, and he's got to make that decision himself. I mean, the things that roll through my brain right now, I want to bring up a couple points. Okay, one, I think Georgia's at the point now where people are concerned, frustrated, they're banging their heads against the wall because Georgia is one of the top 5 or 6 programs in the country, and they're not good enough to be 1, 2, or 3. Where maybe the Richt years, they were 9, 10, 11 a lot of years and not good enough to be 1, 2, or 3. To your point, this is pretty simple. I think the only thing that will change a lot of things, I think the lifeblood of this program is on the recruiting trail. So here's why I think it would change. You asked me that question, how does it change? Who tells him to change? I think when he goes into living rooms and the Arian Smiths of the world, the Jermaine Burtons of the world, the Darnell Washingtons of the world, the Theo Johnsons of the world, they all end up going somewhere else because they think they can be featured and they want to be a part of that offense more than what is being sold to him at Georgia. And they start losing the players they need to make these gains they have to make to catch up with an LSU. I think when those players decide not to come to Georgia, then I think that's when reality sits in about something has to be done about the way Georgia tries to win games offensively.
All right, we're going to fly through a lot of your comments here. Let me remind you, the Pella Window and Door makes the Pella Window Postgame Show possible. A couple ways for you to get in touch. Online, pellasoutheast.us. That's pellasoutheast.us. You can also give them a call when they're done with your showroom at 404-445-2979. 404-445-2979. That'll get you in touch with Pella Window and Door of Georgia. They can help equip your house with energy-efficient windows and doors. All right, a lot of comments, Jeff. We're going to kind of do kind of a rapid-fire deal on this, then we'll get ready to get off the air. We'll let the commenters kind of
Can we have like 2 or 3
Sorry,
minutes?
guys.
Okay, I love you commenters, but we still need to bring news and insight a little bit into this. You and I were both in the post-game locker room. We collected some thoughts from the Georgia football players.
Yeah, we'll rattle off some of this, and then we'll take comments.
Yeah, so, what were 2 or 3 things that stood out to you when you were talking to? I think you got a big one from Richard LeCount.
Yeah,
right?
Richard LeCount said he's definitely planning on playing in the bowl game. I thought that was a very interesting thing to hear from him to a direct question from me. DeAndre Swift said he did not know yet if he plans on playing the bowl game, but his answer was more about his health more so than the decision that he might choose to be a healthy scratch himself. So Swift said he didn't know about his bowl status, but he was speaking in terms of the injury that he's been dealing with, not necessarily the fact that he would choose to pull himself out the way that typical NFL draft picks might do. I asked the draft question to a number of guys. No one that I talked to said they thought about it at all yet. I do know that it seems like Andrew Thomas and Swift both seem, Andrew Thomas in particular maybe, have some conversations coming up, some meetings in the very near future on that. We know what Thomas' eventual future is, but nobody tonight wanted to talk about that. But Richard LeCount did make it clear that he does plan on playing in the bowl game. So if there's an NFL decision forthcoming for him, it will not keep him from playing in the bowl.
Got to be a major recruit for that side of the ball in 2020. You got a chance to talk to Isaiah Wilson. Did you bring that up? Was there anything about Isaiah about that?
Yeah, Wilson says he has not thought about it yet. He said he's trying to take that one game at a time. He's a redshirt sophomore, so he's got that potential decision to make. But according to Wilson, he hasn't thought about that yet.
Yeah, I think it's different. Everybody's going to think about the DeAndre Baker situation last year. But reminder, he was a senior. He had no eligibility left. When you have guys like Wilson, Thomas, Swift sitting out games when they know they have the potential to come back and play for Georgia, you know, that I think the handwriting is kind of clearly on the wall with a lot of those guys. One of a fellow media members said they spoke to Demetrius Robertson after the game, and Demetrius, and this is a quote, a paraphrase of a quote, that he's going to want to see more out of the offense. He's going to want to see the offense open up a little bit more. That was interesting about D-Rob because, number one, for him to say something like that, it also shows you something about maybe where his head's at for next year's team.
It would not be a Pella Windows Postgame Show if we didn't have a lawnmower right behind us. You may be asking the question, though, how's there a lawnmower indoors? We're inside a dome stadium, but there's, I think it's actually like a line painter or something down there. All right.
Falcons game tomorrow, remember?
Is that right? Good stuff for the Falcons. All right, let's take a bunch of comments, and then we're going to get ready to get going here on this. James Crump says that Swift probably will not play. Obviously, his health's going to be a big issue there. Travis Vaught says new offensive coordinator, or should he have another year to improve? I mean, honestly, I think replacing James Coley with Mike Bobo ought to be on the table. Now, if you want to come back and say, hey, first year, you know, Chaney got better in year two, lots of coordinators get better in year two, maybe there's a case to be made for that. But if you're not even considering replacing a guy like James Coley with a guy like Mike Bobo, who can run a version of the spread that LSU showed tonight, because he was running a good bit of spread before he left Georgia in 2014. If you're not at least considering that, then you're not doing your job as UGA head coach.
Well, here's what I'll say, and I'm fine to be in the minority on this one. I think James Coley can get it done for Georgia at offensive coordinator. I believe in what James Coley can do at offensive coordinator, but you'd like to see some more help. You know, like last year, Jim Chaney flourished when he had Jay Johnston, who's now at Colorado, in the room with him as well.
But you say flourished. I think you forget how many times we saw Kirby Smart in the headset yelling at James Coley, Jim Chaney like that.
I know, but we tend to remember the good and the bad, Brandon. But clearly what they had last year offensively with those NFL-bound receivers was better than this. I think a lot of times, you know, we're here doing a show. We got tractors going behind us. You got to remember this. A lot of people are going to point fingers about this loss. And before I want to go down that road, I start thinking about no Pickens in the first half. I start looking at Lawrence Cager on the sideline and a surgical scooter. I start looking at Dominic Blaylock out for the game with what looks like a serious knee injury. And all of a sudden, you've got to think about support, not just the guys to get it done and to make plays in an SEC championship game. You need to see more voices, maybe more analysts. I'm talking about Johnson. Remember Jesse Stone that used to be on this, who was with a graduate assistant that was with Fromm for his first 2 years? You got a lot of areas where Georgia can get better, will get better, and I think they do get better when they have more pieces and a different way of going about how they're going to win games offensively.
Right, but I don't think the solution to a different way to win games offensively, I don't think that's likely in the building. Now, I just don't. I mean, if you're going to get different offensive ideas for new offensive philosophy, to me it seems that has to come from outside the building, because if those ideas existed right now, they would have dialed them up at some point down this season. And listen, if you want to consider everything that Coley brings to the program, his value as a recruiter and everything else, continuity with the possibility that Jake Fromm comes back for a senior year, if you want to consider everything and weigh it on the balance of, a preponderance of evidence that's better to keep him than not, that's fine. But the one thing that I want to make sure you understand, though, there is a risk. This LSU program, I mean, somebody said in our comment section a moment ago, hey, maybe it's just a one-year wonder. Joe Burrow is going to have his last year, but there's no guarantee that this is a one-hit wonder. LSU has built something up. When Orgeron said what he said after the Alabama game and kind of got caught in that viral video moment, I believe that was him declaring war on Alabama, coming for the throne that Alabama's had and pushing Georgia aside to do it. The problem with Georgia sometimes is it has soft competition in the SEC East. It gets to treat Florida as its number one rival, and Florida is not good enough to truly challenge Georgia. So when you face a team that has some teeth, it's a different kind of ball game. And listen, y'all know I'm a fan. I love the Gatorade stuff. I love all that. But when your best rival and your biggest rival is Florida, it's easy to convince yourself you're better than you really are. But when you come out here and face a real measuring stick, it's jerked back to reality.
Well, I mean, this is the thing in a lot of areas for this Georgia program. When you put the toe tag on the season, you've got to look at yourself in the mirror if you're satisfied with being very, very good in certain areas, or do you want to be the best in the country? And I think there are areas, in some ways, we try to kind of kid ourselves a little bit when we were trying to figure out what's the perfect game plan. How can Georgia compete with LSU tonight? And when you start wrinkling in DeAndre Swift's health, no Pickens. I mean, you talk about special players, Brandon, and I think special players matter because when Pickens came into the ball game, Georgia had some juice offensively. They were able to make some plays. Now, of course, LSU had a defensive back, a 5-star that was probably every bit as good as George Pickens on the other side trying to guard him. I think the things you got to think about when you're making that comparison about LSU not going anywhere, going to declare war with Alabama and be there for a while, Burrow's going to be leaving. Got that. You didn't even make that point. You clearly understood that was a guy that was going to be moving on. But where is he at with Brady? What is LSU going to be like when Brady moves on? Is Emsinger
don't be so hold on. Don't be so quick to assume that Joe Brady's leaving. They paid Dave Aranda $2 million. You think they wouldn't stroke the same check to Joe Brady? He's only 30 years old. You think they wouldn't stroke that same check to him? This is not an LSU show. I'm not here to tout the Tigers. But this idea that Joe Brady's definitely moving on, Ed Orgeron's already spoken up about this. They have plans in the works to keep that from happening. And listen, if Georgia, and you could bring back Coley and everything could be better and everything could be fine. It certainly was better for Jim Chaney in year 2. So there's a chance that bringing Coley back works. But if it doesn't, it's over. It's over. You can't even see the lead dogs in the SEC anymore. And it may still be Alabama and it may not be. But you go another year of same old on offense, another year of every game kind of feeling the same. The lead dogs in the SEC, probably LSU, maybe somebody else, they're going to be so far out in front of you, you're not even going to be able to see them anymore.
Time to take some comments.
No. I mean, tell me what you're thinking.
I mean, I think that's a little dramatic. I mean, the difference is the lead dog in
Jeff,
the SEC.
if the Georgia offense looks the way it does next year, if it looks this way again next year, Georgia's not one of the elite teams in the country anymore. They're not.
I mean, that's what we're talking about this whole show. They can't look like this next year, Brandon.
Which is why I'm asking you the question: should they consider moving on from James Coley? Is everything on the table or not?
Here's what I think. Since we're going to go back and forth about this, I said earlier, I believe in what Georgia can do with James Coley. I think if you're going to press that button over and over and over again, you got to realize if you want to evaluate everything over the course of this season, blips, flashes, inconsistencies, whatever you want to say, you got to remember you feel so bad tonight about how they got drilled by LSU when Georgia had no semblance of the weapons on offense to go against this team.
Okay, let's take some comments here on YouTube. Georgia Pyro Dog 81 is not a fan of Mike Bobo, doesn't want him to be here. Byron Dean Butler says we lost too many players from last year from injuries or discipline and could not. Coley's not the main problem, B8. I agree with you on that. I'm not saying that Coley's the main problem. What I'm saying is, should everything be on the table? And when guys are not developing, does that pivot back to coaching? I agree with you. You know, I probably downplayed the loss of the various receiving options that left the program. Thought that Georgia would be more capable in replacing them than they were. Georgia had actually had a pretty significant history of replacing receivers over the last few years, maybe more so than you might realize. And really none of those guys, I mean, for everything we think about McColl now because he was in the NFL, McColl Hardman did not, statistically speaking, have the year you think he did back in 2018.
Well, but he showed up in big games, though. He was the guy that you had to think about with the threat level on offense. Brandon, People play Georgia so much differently in 2019 when there's not a single receiver out there on the sidelines that scares people to death that can beat them downfield. That's just the way it is. I know everybody's looking for certain things, and we want to rush to judgment and say, is Coley the guy? Is Coley the issue? Is it the play calling? Is it the system? You got to ask yourself this question. If Kirby Smart chokes the check for Joe Brady, Georgia brings in Joe Brady, are you doing cartwheels, or are you wondering at the same time, is he going to have the ability to do what he's done at LSU? I think that's the question.
I think that a guy like that who could bring Georgia into more of the modern game. Listen, I've written it and I've said it months ago that I had my issues with the Georgia offense. And then somewhere along the way I said, hey, Kirby Smart's brought great success for Georgia. Let's, speaking as a fan here for a moment, but also as an analyst who, sees the track record, let's see what Kirby Smart can do. Let me back off a little bit. Let me be a little bit more wait and see and kind of make the evaluation at the end of the season. Well, for all intents and purposes, the season's over. It's not working. So what do I think Georgia fans should feel better about next year? As opposed to the same old voice coming back and trying to do it one more time, or as opposed to a little bit of a new voice in the room? Yeah, I would be much. Now, it's not going to be Joe Brady because Joe Brady's probably not going anywhere. But
you really think he's going to stay in LSU? I don't see him staying at LSU. I see him moving up, whether a coordinator. Because you got to remember, you can stroke a check and give him $2 million, Brandon, but you're going to make him the co-offensive coordinator. Is Steve Ensminger going to retire?
They will put Steve Ensminger in the stands so fast your head will spin. They will put him up there with the parents in 5 minutes if it means keeping Joe Brady.
But I think this is a year that Joe Brady has where he elevates himself out of an SEC coordinator type role.
You mean like an NFL quarter? Maybe so, but the point is, it's not going to be a Georgia. Joe Brady's not coming to Georgia. But some sort of new voice, do I think that would make fans feel a little bit better? Would that be a little easier to sell in terms of how you're going to be improved? How you're going to do more you're supposed to do in 2019? Trying to do it in 2020, some sort of new voice, doubling down on the same stuff is just going to be a tough sell. It doesn't mean that it won't work, but it's just going to be a tough sell. And if you try to be the same old next year and it doesn't work, I know you disagree with this, but I'll say it again. There is a risk associated with that because there are brands in life. Sometimes it's the brand you choose for yourself. Sometimes it's the label that gets stuck on you. And there will be people hanging a sign around Georgia's neck if this is 1974 football for another year next year.
Well, to kind of flesh out my point, because you were making a point earlier about are people developing or players developing. Well, you got to say that Pickens and Blaylock have developed so far in their first year at Georgia. I think the problem is Georgia has had to go down the line, and I'm not going to name names. This is not a point the finger at a player type show that's trying to do everything they can for Georgia. But there's a lot of players, Brandon, that they're just trying to get in there, and they're asking, please make a play. Please come through for us, and those are not happening. So they're giving players the chance to play for them and make plays. You saw some guys tonight that were thrust in really big roles. They need those guys in a game like that to come forth. They need those guys to start. The light bulb needs to come on, and when it doesn't happen, and when DeAndre Swift's not 100% and the run game's not there, and you don't have any guys on the outside that scares defenses, I think it all just mushrooms.
So right now, Wisconsin having a lot of success against Ohio State in the Big Ten title game. Very interesting scenario there. I've often wondered what would it.
Do they get in as the number 4 if they beat Ohio State tonight? Oklahoma or Wisconsin? That would be the question.
That's actually a really good question. Wisconsin right now is 8th in the rankings. They're ahead of Florida. They're ahead of Auburn. A couple SEC teams.
I think I'm not going to cut you off, but pretty clearly, if somehow they take down Ohio State, I think they're in there. They've got to be.
That's a very interesting scenario that could be playing itself out. I'm imagining, though, there's still a good bit of football left there. Let's get a couple more comments here. Robert Bentley Jenkins says not a fan of Coley, but imagine if next season is more of the same, then he's gone for sure. And yeah, you may say Kirby Smart has won enough 3 consecutive SEC East that he's not under the kind of political pressure required to make a coaching move. That's not what a lot of people want to hear, but that just may very well be true. It may be that he comes back. I just think about things sometimes from a public relations standpoint, and that's a pretty tough PR sell if things don't get any better and if things look a lot the same. Steve Shafini says you've got to at least admit that Coley's at best part of the problem, and that's certainly true. There are other more, Coley is part of the problem. There are other guys, who are that as well. James Crump says it was national championship or bust this season. Next season with the Fromm and Coley, it's definitely not happening. I won't say definitely about really anything. I'm not going to say that. I'm just going to say the risk that you take on when you try to double down on more of the same. But the other point about this being a national championship or bust type season, it definitely was. Smart had a chance to say that the other day and kind of soften his language, but he's not going to give the media a hook which to hang him on. I understand that.
I think they need to find, like, to me, what did we learn? The Lawrence Cager experiment worked, Brandon, did it not? Bringing in a graduate transfer? That had the penchant. And I want to be clear, I don't know if they beat Florida without a Lawrence Cager out there.
Oh, I know for a fact they definitely do not.
So when we're making these judgments, I think the quickest judgment we can make is, why don't they have players behind a Cager, behind a Pickens, behind a Blaylock, to keep rolling and go score for score with an LSU? Because without Cager, Georgia wouldn't be in this game. And then there would be bigger problems for the 2019 season. So what I'm trying to say there is it's not just the hotshot, highly rated recruit that comes in. Maybe there's more answers out there in the graduate transfer market.
But the reason why they don't have that kind of depth is because the top end 5-star guys, and yes, I know Pickens came and Blaylock at one point in time was a 5-star, but for the most part, most of the receivers in that 5-star population don't want to play in this offense. That's just a fact. They just don't want to.
The elite receivers in the country, we got to remember, look where they're going, Brandon. One of them's going to Texas A&M. One of them's going to Ohio State. Obvious reasons to go there and play for Ohio State. One of them was committed to LSU even before this Joe Brady miracles that started when he started walking on water. You go down the list, you've got guys going to UCLA, you got guys going to Oregon. Not everybody is playing pinball with the scoreboard. Clemson's getting their guys, but they're not getting the number 1 and number 2 guys like they've gotten years past. So I think you got to give him another year to change that room a little bit. Because remember, and I don't want this to be a coulda, woulda, shoulda from Jeff type episode, but I think when Georgia put together this team and they were trying to figure out how they could shine at the receiver spot, all of their plans hinged on having a Jeremiah Holloman back as well. And in some ways, Georgia was scurrying. Georgia was trying to figure out a way where they could still get a lot of that production, or not that same production, but offset that production when the loss of a guy like Holloman.
So I think it'll be very interesting to follow. Let me get a few more comments. We'll get ready to roll out of here as part of our Pella Windows Postgame Show here today. And, of course, the next time we talk to you in this venue will be from a bowl game.
One thing I want to say there is, like, I don't want you to think of it exactly this way, but imagine LSU's offense this year with a Burrow still there, but maybe he doesn't have a Chase, or they lose Chase with an injury. Then they go Marshall, then they go Jefferson. Everybody moves up one. I think that changes a lot of things, because otherwise, Brandon, you're even making the point that the elite wide receivers are not choosing this offense right now. Well, there's a difference between the top 4 and 5 receivers in the country and number 9, 10, and 11. Those are the guys that are special, and those are the guys that can beat even a great Georgia defensive back, coached by Kirby Smart, Mel Tucker, Charlton Warren, Dan Lanning, that are going to go to the NFL too. There's a difference between those special players.
Yeah, I think so. I just think you have to be, as a program, committed to that brand of football to get guys like that to want to play. Let me get a few more here. Brian Boyd says Fromm took a step back again. It's time to open up the quarterback competition. He's not a first-round quarterback. So here's what I'll say. For the entirety of the season, Fromm has played far worse this year than I would have ever expected. It's just a fact. He has played far worse this year than I ever would have expected. However, of all the quarterbacks that I think that Georgia has a reasonable chance of having in 2020, Fromm would still be my first choice over anybody that you can bring in on the graduate transfer market, over anybody that you can bring in as a true freshman or anything like that, junior college transfer even. Of the reasonable choices of who I think Georgia could get, Jake Fromm is, for me, still the best quarterback for Georgia in 2020. I feel very confident saying that, but I'm also not going to sugarcoat it. Fromm has had nowhere near the year this year I would expect him to have.
You know what, and I think, I'm trying to think right now like a writer would, like a columnist would. This is the first time when Georgia has tasted a bitter season-ending defeat where folks can't say we're right there.
Right.
We're so close. We're right there. This is the first time, and I know Dog Nation, you want to hear something positive. You probably already kicked the curb, or you're walking the dog right now, or you're on the treadmill because you're so mad at the way this thing has gone. This is one where Georgia looks at it and goes, we're not close. We're not right there. And we've got to figure out a way. You know how Kirby Smart says all the time that they go visit everywhere, they go borrow from NFL, they go check everything out, they take a look at everything out. This is one of those where you got to pop the hood on the side of the road of the Kirby Smart era and start looking underneath the hood and saying, we got to get some more cylinders in here.
She ain't got no engine. That's what. When they pop the hood on this offense, that's what they're left to say. She ain't got no engine, because certainly a lot of times that's what it certainly seemed like. All right, we're going to get ready to get off the air for the Pella Windows Postgame Show. So listen, let me try to put a happy face on this on the way out the door, and I realize it's going to fall on deaf ears a lot of people. There is a lot coming down the pipe. I never know, is it pipe or pike? I never know what you're coming down. Are you coming down the pike or coming down the pipe?
I think you do both, actually.
Well, whichever one you choose to come down, the pipe or the pike, there's a lot of recruiting news coming down there. Jeff's mentioned the name Arian Smith and Jermaine Burton a number of times. I think those guys are big gets, and the fact that they're kind of reconsidering Georgia now, I think that's potentially good news. Adding them to what Georgia currently has would be a little bit of a drastic beginning to the transformation of this Georgia wide receiver situation. It is no coincidence that the position group that underperformed Georgia the most is also the one in which Georgia has recruited the least. I'm talking about predating Kirby Smart. That is not a coincidence. You can draw a straight line from blah, blah, blah 3-star to the fact that the Georgia wide receiver situation this year, after a couple guys bolted to the NFL, it kind of was what it was. So Georgia may be getting some good news there in that regard. And you know what? One way or another, I've said this before, Jeff, and I'll say it one more time. Let me put the positive spin on Jake Fromm for a moment, and the people who are mad at Fromm are going to be mad at me, but I don't care. You know what? I'm a big boy. I can live with that. Yeah. Joe Burrow's older than Sam Darnold.
Joe Burrow.
Hold on.
2 years older than Fromm.
Yeah. Joe Burrow shows you what a smart guy, a little older, a little more mature, what he's able to do. I'm not telling you that Jake Fromm's going to have a Joe Burrow season, because based on the way that Fromm played this year, that doesn't seem all that likely, just to be completely honest with you. But the best for Fromm still being yet to come, I wouldn't write off that possibility. You said it before, I'm going to echo it again. You're so right. I got too much respect for our audience to say, hey, guess what? I know it may seem bad right now, but sunshine's right around the corner. I'm not going to tell people that, because I don't know. But there is going to be some good news coming in the days ahead. Georgia's going to win some recruiting battles. Georgia may win on a Monday with Theo Johnson, maybe. There is some good news coming at some point in time. It seems like it's never going to happen again, but at some point in time, something good's going to happen again.
So next year, they're going to have another elite defense. Folks, I'm going to say now, Richard LeCount comes back. I think this defense can be every bit as good as the one that they had this year. That's not sunshine pumping right there. That's the reality. All those players are going to get better. The guys that move on. Georgia's got people coming. The defense won't be the problem. I think what Georgia's got to do offensively, they just got to get more. Like the guys that they were playing outside today, forced into the rotation or whatever, they just got to get more guys like Dominic Blaylock, more guys like the Darnell Washingtons, the Theo Johnsons of the world. And they just got to look at their offensive structure a little bit differently. You mentioned Jake Fromm. I'm not here. No one's here we're just going to present what we see. Jake Fromm is still a great college quarterback. I think the problem with him is that with what Georgia had, limited firepower right on the edges at receiver a lot this year, they needed him to play like one of the top 5 quarterbacks in the country. And really, he didn't play anywhere close to that this year. But Jake Fromm at quarterback, even in this worst season so far of his career at Georgia, I think he's still a top 20 quarterback in the country. I think he's still one of the top 2 or 3 quarterbacks in the SEC. And I'm like you. Jake Fromm coming back is the best fit for this Georgia football program next year.
So we'll see where it goes. Obviously, wish we had better news and wish I could put a happier face on it. But as many of you said, there's not a lot of positives to take away from tonight. And frankly, I don't think there's a lot of positives to take away either. Georgia got its head kicked in tonight, really for the first time in the Kirby Smart era in terms of not really having a silver lining to put around it. I think you're all right for saying that, and we'll obviously see where it goes.
So not trying to be the silver lining guy, but let's say this, Brandon. If this is the game and this is the kicking that forces Georgia to realize that, yeah, we can't be all about that. We got to be a little different. If this is the game that makes this staff as a whole look at themselves in the mirror and say, you know what? Let's approach this differently. Let's keep our identity about who we are, who we want to be. Remember, we heard Coach Orgeron in the press conference today. They were changing his offense. They were doing things differently. And he said, I hope we keep our identity. He said it was real hard to get away from the fullback. He said, I want to keep our identity about being a physical football team and running the football. Guys, nobody's asking Georgia to start looking like a run and shoot team or a spread team all the time. All they're looking for, we're looking for this team to take a step or two towards that direction.
Well, let me speak for our audience, and we're going to get off the air. I'm pretty attuned to my guys and gals on this. Here's what I believe they're going to say. They love Kirby. The majority of the people watching, listening to us right now, watching and listening to us on a regular basis, they don't have confidence in him to change. They don't have confidence in his willingness to change. Right now, there's a belief that Kirby likes control more than success.
I think it goes back to a point we made. Nick Saban decided his way of thinking wasn't going to work. He had to relinquish control, and he needed to back his program away from what he thought was the cement way he was going to win football.
You're speaking about a possibility of what could happen, and gosh, I wish that would. But my point is just because Georgia got its brains beat in doesn't mean Kirby Smart's going to be motivated to do anything any different than he has before, because new ideas require new personnel. It requires different kinds of recruits. It requires different kinds of coaches. Doesn't mean you have to make wholesale changes. Doesn't mean you have to really fire the guys you have. But if you're going to do things different, somebody's got to be different. The kinds of players that you're looking to bring in, the kinds of plays you're calling, the people who are contributing to the calling of those plays. Something's got to be different to bring in new ideas. Right?
Yeah, I agree with that.
All right, so good stuff. Well, not good stuff, but you know what I'm saying. Y'all have a good weekend. Back on Monday for Dog Nation Daily. We'll figure it all out. Jeff Sintel, really and truly, he's gonna be red hot this month. A lot of recruiting stuff coming down the line. Like I said before, something good's going to happen again at some point in time. So be ready when it does. Thanks for being here on our Pella Windows Postgame Show. Sleep well tonight. Enjoy the weekend. We'll talk to you soon. Talk about this some more in the forum at forum.dognation.com. Go on dognation.com. Read all the good stuff from Mike and Connor and Jeff and everybody else who's got all the written stuff to come. Do all that. And we will figure out how Georgia gets better, and we'll hope to hear the words from Kirby Smart that indicate that Georgia is taking those steps. Really good stuff from the players tonight. They played their hearts out in the locker room and get a chance to hear from them. You may not be satisfied with the results, but you can't fault those guys. It was great to hear from them. We'll have a lot of those interviews up on the Dog Nation YouTube page here coming up in the days ahead as well. So I'll sign off here as part of the Pella Windows Postgame Show. Jeff Sintel, appreciate your thoughts as always. We'll talk to you again soon. Thanks for being with us.